adménytenge, őszamját is becseng, mit manu, umsinigen, színman, vagy what we just looked. The Batu Stadion on choice, and umsinigen, get with my no, join in how they start with the search and which one is here. So it's going on like this here. So those were words in Cree, greetings and appreciation, especially for allowing me to enter your territory. It's a real privilege and honor for me to be here. I'll talk briefly about, before going into the bill, which is an important bill. It's probably the most fundamental legislation that the Parliament of Canada will have to consider in a very long time. And that debate on my bill will come next June, and the vote on second reading for this bill is coming next June. So the period from now till that debate and the second reading vote is important for me. That's why I've been traveling since I introduced the bill back in April throughout the country. I've been to BC, I've been to Alberta, I've been to Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and now here in the territory. So I'll continue doing that until the House resumes in September. And one of the objectives for me is, of course, to make sure that that I show the government that this bill has the backing of not only Indigenous peoples of this country, but also non-Indigenous. Because I think reconciliation in this country is a matter for all of us, not just Indigenous, but also non-Indigenous. So that's why I've held meetings both with Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities throughout my travels, and I'm glad to see that my non-Indigenous is good today. So before going into that, I just want to briefly, I know that the bio is pretty short, but there are certain elements that I think that are worth mentioning here, because it illustrates, at least with some perspective, where I come from. I'm part of a generation of Crees, the last generation of Crees that were born and raised in the bush. I was born literally on the land, under a tent in northern Quebec. I spent the first 7 years of my life, 7 years of my life, hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering with my siblings and my parents before being taken away to residential school for the following 2 years. So, so I spent 10 years in residential school from the age of 7 and on. So I'm what they call a residential survivor, but some of us like to call ourselves residential warriors. Because we managed to get through that. When I came out of residential school, the first thing I did, because it was the only thing I knew how to do well, was go back in the forest. So I spent the next 2 years coming out of residential school, back in the forest. And you know, in life, you get these opportunities and encounters that you do not necessarily expect all the time. And while I was in the bush for the first 2 years after my residential school experience, I was back in my village for a couple of hours to pick up a couple of things in the village, and the intention was to head back right away. And I happened to bump into the chief, Waswanipi back then. By the way, Waswanipi means light on the water. And I also wanted to mention that my favorite food when I was growing up in the forest is the muskrat. It's the best tasting meat, for me at least. So Waswanipi means light on the water. That's where I come from. So I was walking in the village and bumped into the chief back then, and this is 1985. And the chief said, Romeo, there's an important symposium going on in Montreal. It deals with the 10 years of the James Bay North Quebec Agreement. My people signed the first modern treaty back in 1975. It's the first modern treaty because it also involved, for the first time, in the treaty, the province. So the province of Quebec is also a signatory of the James Bay North Quebec Agreement. So we signed that in 1975. There's this symposium going on in Montreal, and the chief said, you should go, it should be interesting for you as a young person, and listen to what happened, the history of the James Bay North Quebec Agreement, all the important actors around those negotiations and the agreement around in Montreal. So he said, we'll pay for your way, pay for your travel, your meals, room, accommodation, and registration. So I went. On the second day of that symposium, there was a panel of all of the different lawyers that represented the different parties that James Bay North Quebec Agreement. So the lawyer that represented Quebec was there, the lawyer that represented Canada was there, the lawyer that represented Hydro-Quebec was there, the lawyer that represented the Inuit people was there, and the lawyer that represented my people, the Cree, was on that panel. And I was a young man back then. I was sitting in the audience, and as I was listening to the lawyer that represented the Cree back then, talking about Cree rights, talking about the Cree people, talking about what the Cree wanted to protect in the James Bay North Quebec Agreement, I said to myself, and I really said it in this way to myself, I said, fuck, I can do that. And that's exactly what I did. I went to law school the following year. So I did my law school from 86 to 89. Became Deputy Grand Chief of the Grand Council of Cree. There are two elected officials among my people that are elected by the people, not by the chiefs, but by the people. It's the Grand Chief and the Deputy Grand Chief of the Grand Council of Cree. They're elected by the Cree people. So I became Deputy Grand Chief in 1990. Very crucial years, if you recall. We had Augu crisis during that time. We had a constitutional crisis during that time. The negotiations of Meech Lake Line and the negotiations that led to the Charlottetown Accord. But also, in our case, we were fighting the second phase of the James Bay project, the Great Mill Development Project. So all this happened while I just got elected as Deputy Grand Chief. And for a person that wanted to do a master's degree in political science, well, I didn't have to go to university. I just did it on the ground, fighting for my people. And I decided to run. I'm not your ordinary politician. But that's the reason why this is my second and last mandate. I'm not continuing after this as a member of Parliament. But I do want to achieve certain things during my remaining 3 years here. But at that time I decided to run because the Cree people living in Quebec needed, during those crisis moments of constitutional and fighting yet another mega hydroelectric project and a constitutional crisis happening at the same time, I thought that the Cree needed someone, a spokesperson that could express himself or herself in French. So I decided to run for that very reason. Because it's important to do that in Quebec, because in order for Quebec to understand it, I think Indigenous peoples in Quebec are in a very particular situation because of that. Quebec wants more autonomy, so do we. Quebec wants their resources, happens to be ours. They want territory, that happens to be ours as well. So there's a constant struggle in Quebec between Indigenous peoples and the Quebec government and resource developers in the country. So it was important, I thought at that time, back in 1990, to have a Cree spokesperson speaking French to the Quebecois in order for the Quebecois to really appreciate what we stand for, what we are saying in the face of all these things. So I was Deputy Grand Chief from 90 to 93. And there again, I decided to do just one mandate because I thought by the time I was done with my mandate in 1993, most of those issues were passed or settled In the case of the Great Well Project, there was a new government in 1994 that decided to shelve the project. So that's the reason why I became Deputy Grand Chief. I want to talk a bit about the process that led to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Some of you may know about the history of this document, but some don't, and I think it's important to have a better appreciation of this document. One needs to understand how we got there. And again, this was a special encounter back then when our Cree ambassador to the UN, the Cree Nation, the Cree people have a UN ambassador, or an ambassador to the UN, which was Ted Moses back then. Ted one day asked me to accompany him to the United Nations because he said there's this important process that's going to start at the UN. They've created this working group on indigenous populations of the United Nations, and we're going to be negotiating a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And he said to me, why don't you come? Just accompany me, just observe. You don't have to do anything, just watch how we do it. So I decided to go with him back in. And that's where this whole work started. The working group started working on this document back in 1984. And the working group on indigenous populations had a double mandate. First, to review annually all developments related to the recognition of indigenous peoples throughout the world. There's some 370 million indigenous people throughout the planet in some 72 countries. So there's more than 370 million indigenous people throughout the world, in more than 72 countries. So we have to review every year what's going on around the world with indigenous peoples and their rights. And secondly, the second part of the mandate was to develop a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that's where our role as jurists and lawyers came into play, because we had to, this working group had some 600 to 1,500 participants annually for 10 days to discuss the declaration, to negotiate the terms of the declaration, and so on and so forth. It was the biggest forum every year that the United Nations attended by so many people. It varied between 600 and 1,500 people every year. So the process was difficult. You have to know the procedure, how you can get your word in, how you can take some time to talk about specific issues during those debates, because it lasted only 10 days every year. So it was important for all of us to get our word in. So the process lasted 23 years, 10 days a year. 23 years it took us to negotiate the 46 articles that are contained in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I must say from the outset that one of the biggest challenges we had from the outset was the term peoples for indigenous peoples. Don't forget that under international law, only peoples have a right to self-determination, not populations. That was the name of the working group on indigenous populations, because the UN was not yet written. So we had to argue our way through for many years. It took at least a decade for the member states who were also participants in the process to accept that indigenous peoples were indeed peoples under international law with the right to self-determination. Because under the two human rights covenants, peoples have a right to self-determination. And that's why we argued so hard. And we had to use all of the arguments. The UN Charter, for instance, the UN Charter under which the member states of the United Nations are valid, forbids any discrimination in terms of recognition of human rights. So we have to remind the member states that participate in the process, hey, you cannot say these are peoples, but these are not peoples, although we have all of the characteristics of a people, of peoples. We have a traditional territory, we have a traditional legal and political systems, we have a distinct culture and language, the capacity to deal with others on a nation-to-nation basis and sign treaties with others. Those are the characteristics of a people under international law. The term peoples under international law is not defined. So international jurisprudence uses those characteristics. And indigenous peoples in this country fit well in that framework of peoples. So after a decade of discussion on that word, peoples, we went on to debate for another 7 years whether or not these peoples have also the right of self-determination like other peoples.